Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Nebraska. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Nebraska, 1923. The wind swept across the broken plains, carrying dust and the faint clang of farm tools resting against weathered barns. At precisely 7 p.m. on a late autumn evening, a traveler rolled into the small settlement of Grafton Hollow, about 70 miles from the nearest railroad junction. All was quiet, except for the low moan of the wind through skeletal corn stalks. He came seeking provisions, directions, and, as he would soon learn, answers that would haunt him. Grafton Hollow was hardly more than a scattering of homesteads and farmland. Its few residents clustered around an aging general store, a weather-beaten post office, and a single church whose steeple, cracked and crooked, leaned like a judge casting a verdict. The proprietor of the store, old Mr. Carter, would later describe the newcomer thus. He looked like a man worn by too many winters, sunken cheeks, hard eyes, and a gait that carried caution. That man was Isaac Trevitt, known in county records as a homesteader who arrived about 5 years earlier from a township in neighboring Kansas. Before settling near Grafton Hollow, the land parcel had passed through 2 previous owners, both of whom left under murky circumstances. Some villagers claimed the land was cursed, though local historians later traced faint parallels to the Osage Indian murders era, where sudden inherited wealth and mysterious deaths plagued a region not far from Nebraska's southern border. Though the cases are different in nature, both hint at quiet conspiracies buried beneath seemingly ordinary lives. Trevitt's holdings were Mepaishi, Odest, a clapboard house, a root cellar, and a fenced yard with a shaky coop, but the soil immediately around his dwelling was oddly disturbed, loose earth, faint traces of ash, and the hint of furrows that did not match his neighbor's neat rows. Others in Grafton Hollow remembered that at night they heard low whispers, a distant humming, or so they claimed, carried on the wind. On the evening of November 12, 1923, Mrs. Harriet Beach, a neighbor whose home lay 2 quarters over, walked past Trevitt's fence while returning from fetching water. She swore she saw a figure move behind the curtained window, a backlit silhouette, tall, arms raised, standing perfectly still. She told the local constable, but the report was dismissed as overactive nerves. Then came Miss Lillian Shaw, a schoolteacher at the Hollow's one-room schoolhouse. She delivered a package to Trevitt's door mid-morning and reported his odd behavior. A cold greeting, a silent nod, and a refusal to allow her further in. She noted the floorboards inside looked discolored, as if stained, or worse. No records from that day showed her ever returning. Her disappearance would alert county authorities to Trevitt's oddness. A rural constable named J.P. Monroe, based in the neighboring township, was called in by the Hollow's postmaster. Monroe arrived at Trevitt's house near dusk, lantern in hand. He reported the front door unlocked, hinges creaking. The interior was dim, smelling faintly of decay. A dining table was set with a pot lid askew, plates empty, but no sign of Lillian or any guest. Monroe noted sputtered footprints and patches of damp soil on the floor. At that moment, Trevitt stepped from the shadows with a calm voice. "I was expecting company. They must have gone out." He offered no explanation for the missing guest or for the odd stains on the floor. Monroe made note in his ledger, then left to gather reinforcements. As night closed the sky, a cold rain began. The land around Trevitt's home seemed ghostly beneath the lantern glow. Monroe, walking back to his buggy, thought he glimpsed a shape vanish behind the barn. The moment shattered him. He galloped toward it, but found only empty air. By the next morning, Constable Monroe returned to the Trevitt homestead with 2 others, Deputy Clyde Evans and Reverend Amos Harlan, who served as a reluctant moral witness for such inspections. The rain had hardened the earth into gray, crusted slabs, and faint wagon ruts led toward the back of the property. Monroe's previous footprints were nearly erased, but the ground bore new impressions, heavier, deeper. When they entered the kitchen, the sour odor Monroe remembered from the night before had thickened into something unmistakable, the smell of spoiled broth and wet ash. A kettle still sat on the iron stove, contents charred to the sides. Evans lifted the lid with the end of his revolver. He gagged, muttered a curse, and slammed it shut again. They would not record precisely what they saw in that moment, only that the remnants did not appear to be of livestock origin. The Reverend's account survives in his diary. The man stood at the doorway, hands folded, calm as though we were speaking of the weather. When Monroe asked about the kettle, he said, "That was for supper. I waste nothing of what this land provides." There was no sign of Miss Shaw, but in the cellar beneath the home they found signs of hurried excavation, a pit partly filled with damp soil, bits of fabric, and a wooden spoon warped by fire. A stack of ledgers lay on a shelf, each marked "Guests." Names appeared with dates, often followed by a small cross. None were familiar to Grafton Hollow residents. The county prosecutor, summoned 2 days later, noted how the town's population had quietly dwindled in the past 2 years. Peddlers, travelers, 2 drifters from Hastings. The local paper, the Hollow Gazette, mentioned a pattern of vanishings, dismissed by most as frontier gossip. Yet when state authorities cross-checked names from Trevitt's ledger, they matched records of missing persons report. Ted, in nearby counties. To avoid panic, the sheriff sealed the property and sent word to the district court in Lincoln. But news traveled quickly. Rumors spread that the cellar contained bones, that the stew pot had been used for unspeakable things. Families left town. Shops closed. Historians later compared the fear that swept Grafton Hollow to the hysteria that surrounded the Osage murders a decade earlier. Cases where greed and hidden violence lay beneath polite rural life. Though there were no direct ties, both histories reflect the same dread, that evil, when cloaked in respectability, may sit quietly beside you at supper. When the officers returned on the 4th day with an arrest warrant, the house stood open and silent. The stove was cold. The ledger was gone. Trevitt had vanished into the prairie wind. Weeks later, hunters stumbled upon a ruined campsite along the creek 20 miles west, with charred bones scattered among burned logs. Whether they were animal or human was never proven. The county coroner's records were lost in a courthouse fire 3 years later. By winter, Grafton Hollow's population had shrunk by half. Locals began calling it the Empty County. Reverend Harlan left a final entry in his diary before he moved east. Some houses are built to hold more than families. They hold secrets too heavy to bear. Spring arrived late to Grafton Hollow in 1924, bringing sleet instead of sun. The townsfolk hoped the thaw might wash away what the newspapers had started calling the Stew Man affair. But fear has a way of clinging longer than frost. Doors were bolted at dusk, and mothers kept children from wandering too far along the creek bed. The county sent a new investigator, Marshal Edwin Carver, a quiet, methodical man with a background in agricultural inspection. He traveled by rail from Lincoln, carrying a satchel of papers, a camera, and a small revolver. His orders were simple: locate Isaac Trevitt, alive or dead, and secure any remaining evidence before scavengers or souvenir seekers destroyed it. Carver interviewed what remained of the Hollow's residents. Their testimonies were inconsistent, sometimes wild, but each shared the same unease. Old Mr. Carter claimed he'd seen a figure near the well behind Trevitt's house, pale and stooped, as though searching for something buried. Another, a farmhand named Milton Reeves, said he'd heard a single knock on his door one night, followed by the smell of smoke and stew drifting on the wind. In the courthouse archives at Geneva, Carver located the original deed to Trevitt's property. The land had once belonged to a widow named Ada Holcomb, who vanished in 1919. She'd sold the homestead for a fraction of its value to an unnamed buyer using cash. Her description, tall, thin, with hollow eyes, was unsettlingly similar to that of Trevitt himself, leading some later researchers to speculate he had been using multiple identities. Carver's notes describe his visit to the abandoned homestead in chilling detail. The wind carries a low hum through the window frames. Dust sits thick on every surface. There are flies here, but no meat. He sketched the cellar pit and found fragments of cloth wedged between floorboards, preserved under lazim. Of dried mud. They bore initials embroidered in delicate thread. L.S. The discovery confirmed what many already feared. Miss Lillian Shaw had never left that house. Midway through his investigation, Carver cross-referenced the names from witness statements with state missing persons ledgers. Several matched transient workers who disappeared between 1920 and 1923. The pattern resembled reports cited in the Osage Indian murders, not in motive, but in the quiet efficiency of removal, how victims seemed to vanish without noise, without notice. It was as if some dark practicality guided both tragedies. By midsummer, Carver's health began to fail. Locals whispered that he'd been touched by whatever had haunted that house. He complained of sleepless nights and a metallic taste in the air around the property. His last journal entry, dated July 11, 1924, read simply, "The stew is not yet cold. He is not done eating." 3 days later, Carver was found dead in his boarding room, cause undetermined. His papers, sketches, and notes were sealed by the county court and later misplaced during administrative transfers. What survived came from fragments in the prosecutor's office and Reverend Harlan's surviving diary pages. By autumn, the homestead had become a landmark for morbid curiosity seekers. Some claimed to have seen light flickering in the windows long after nightfall. Others said they heard the scrape of a chair or the echo of a ladle striking iron. But no one ever stayed long enough to confirm. By the winter of 1925, the story of Isaac Trevitt had settled into rumor, half folklore, half fear. Newspapers outside Nebraska turned it into a sensational headline, though local editors preferred to let it fade. In Grafton Hollow, the homestead stood untouched, its roof sagging under snow, the chimney cracked and dark. Children dared each other to approach it, claiming that on cold nights they could smell something sweet and rancid drifting from the cellar vents. Yet in the state archives at Lincoln, a clerk named Dr. Howard Ellery, tasked with organizing the abandoned Carver files, noticed a peculiar thing. One of Trevitt's ledgers had been mailed anonymously to the courthouse weeks after the marshal's death. It arrived wrapped in brown paper, unmarked except for a smudge of soot. Inside were pages written in an uneven hand, columns of dates, initials, and brief notations such as welcomed, stayed, or gone. Ellery's handwriting analysis suggested that some entries were penned years apart, as if Trevitt had occasionally paused, then resumed with a different script. The final page contained a short line. "All meat is borrowed from the same earth." The ledger stirred new attention. Reporters descended again on the hollow, interviewing the remaining residents. An old carpenter named Amos Brill recalled repairing Trevitt's porch the summer before the disappearances. "He was quiet, polite," Brill said, "but he never looked you in the eye. He kept muttering about debts paid in kind." The constable who first confronted Trevitt, J.P. Monroe, refused further comment. His wife later told a newspaper that he'd burned his own uniform and resigned from service, claiming, "I'll not wear a badge that couldn't stop what lived in that house." In April 1926, a fire consumed most of the Trevitt property. The cause was listed as lightning, though no storm had been recorded. At Week, witnesses said the flames burned white, unlike any natural fire. Afterward, investigators found something remarkable. Beneath the foundation stones, a narrow trench lined with tin, apparently used for drainage, but containing fragments of porcelain, charred utensils, and what might have been a human molar. The coroner's notes were vague, describing the remains only as non-animal in nature. Decades later, researchers comparing rural crime archives drew parallels between the Hollow tragedy and the systematic disappearances chronicled in the Osage Indian murders. In both, isolation allowed terrible acts to hide in plain sight. In fact, one contemporary newspaper editorial even remarked that Nebraska's quiet fields conceal their sins better than oil ever did. The Trevitt case officially closed without arrest, conviction, or confirmed body. County funds ran dry, and the sheriff's department dissolved 2 years later. By then, only a few dozen people remained in Grafton Hollow. Reverend Harlan's old church bell cracked, and its steeple finally collapsed in a summer storm, leaving the cemetery below unblessed and overgrown. Those who lived nearby began to say the air around the ruins turned metallic in summer heat, as though the land itself still remembered the iron kettle and what had been cooked inside. No one built there again. By 1927, the Trevitt story had become a cautionary tale, whispered at county fairs and in schoolyards, often exaggerated by storytellers who'd never set foot near Grafton Hollow. Still, certain officials tried to restore order to the record. Among them was Dr. Silas Morton, a criminologist from the University of Nebraska, who arrived that spring to collect surviving documents for academic study. His work, though clinical, reignited public fascination and fear. Morton's surviving correspondence to the county clerk is chillingly precise. The cellar walls appear to have absorbed something organic. Even after years of exposure, the odor persists. The soil near the foundation shows traces of rendered fat mixed with ash. He described the homestead as architecturally unstable, yet strangely fortified beneath the ground floor. One chamber was bricked shut, the mortar newer than the surrounding structure. When workmen removed a portion of the wall, they found only darkness beyond, a void that extended deeper than expected, lined with rusted hooks and an old iron pulley. The excavation halted when one worker fainted after discovering a strand of hair embedded in dried plaster. Morton, fascinated yet cautious, proposed that Trevitt might have practiced a self-sustaining isolationism, living off travelers in both economic and literal terms. His report was controversial, not least because it drew uncomfortable comparisons to the social unrest that shadowed the Osage Indian murders, another reminder that beneath prosperity and silence, entire lives could vanish unnoticed. He referenced that grim chapter twice in his lectures, using it as a mirror to Trevitt's hollow plains, the rich and the poor alike devoured by greed or necessity. In local memory, Trevitt had transformed into a mythic figure, a ghost, a warning, but some details kept the case grounded in eerie plausibility. So, for instance, a railway conductor passing through nearby Clay County claimed to have picked up a man matching Trevitt's description months after the fire. The passenger bought a ticket under the name Isaac Trent, carrying a satchel that smelled faintly of smoke and vinegar. When asked about his destination, he said only, "Anywhere they haven't tasted me yet." Authorities investigated but found no trace. The conductor later withdrew his statement, saying he must have been mistaken in the face. Yet that brief report, filed on yellowed paper, remains the last known clue. By 1929, Grafton Hollow was almost deserted. Grass swallowed the fences, and the remaining homes fell quiet. Only Reverend Harlan's abandoned church remained as a landmark. Travelers who dared to camp nearby described uneasy dreams, visions of supper tables, of hands stirring unseen pots. In one of his final letters before leaving the area, Dr. Morton wrote, "I no longer study Trevitt. I study what he left behind, an emptiness that feeds on remembrance." When he died in 1932, his estate inventory listed a single missing object, a brass key labeled root cellar. By the early 1930s, the legend of Isaac Trevitt had faded into a ghostly murmur, a story that surfaced only when travelers stopped for gas in the nearby towns and locals warned them not to take the old road west. Yet beneath the dust of silence, a few restless souls continued their quiet investigations. One such man was Professor William Caro, a folklorist from Omaha who had once studied rural disappearances and frontier superstition. Caro visited Grafton Hollow in 1933, carrying with him a phonograph recorder, several notebooks, and a curiosity that would border on obsession. He interviewed remaining families, descendants of those who hadn't fled after the fire. Many were reluctant to speak, but one, a widow named Edna Brill, remembered her father's story. He had been the carpenter who once repaired Trevitt's porch. "He said the boards creaked like voices underfoot," she whispered. "And when he hammered the last nail, the man just stood there smiling, said the house was hungry again." Caro recorded this in several similar accounts, later writing that Grafton Hollow was a place where rumor ossified into belief. He described the area as unnaturally still, even on windy days, and noted that birds avoided the burned foundation of the Trevitt homestead. In a letter to a colleague at the university, Caro mentioned his plan to link the Trevitt case to other isolated tragedies across the Great Plains. Episodes of quiet predation, as he called them. One of his cross-references was the Osage Indian murders, a comparison he used not to sensationalize but to contextualize. Both stories revealed how ordinary greed, when unchecked, could metastasize into horror. He wrote, "The lesson of Osage County was not money, but what silence buys. Trevitt's Hollow bought its silence in flesh." Later that summer, Caro camped near the ruins to make field recordings of windpaw that turns through the remaining cellar vents. On his third night, he wrote in his notebook, "Something moves beneath. Not air, not water. Something heavier." He returned to Omaha a week later, pale and unwell. Colleagues noted that his once steady hands trembled when he attempted to transcribe his notes. Within months, he abandoned his lectures and withdrew from public life. His unfinished manuscript, The Hollow Remains, a study in frontier silence, was published posthumously in 1937, though half its pages were missing. In one surviving draft, Caro reflected, "We inherit the calm of our ancestors' crimes. The plains look empty because they have already been fed." After his death, the university sealed his research recordings. The reel labeled Trevitt Cellar, Wind Test 3, reportedly contained faint rhythmic sounds, but archivists dismissed them as interference. Only one technician noted quietly that the pattern resembled a heartbeat. From then on, the Trevitt legend passed into oral folklore, retold around campfires, whispered in truck stops, often ending with the same warning: if you smell stew where no fire burns, don't linger. By 1935, Grafton Hollow existed only in county maps and half-erased memory. The last census listed fewer than a dozen residents, most of them elderly and unwilling to speak to outsiders. The land was slowly being reclaimed by prairie grass, which grew over foundations and stone wells, hiding the scars of what had been. Yet the legend did not die. It simply wandered. A traveling preacher named Elias Boone, who passed through that region during the Dust Bowl years, kept a small leather-bound journal. Among entries describing drought and hunger, one stood out. Stopped at an empty house near the Old Creek Road. The door was gone, but supper was set on the table. Still warm. Boone's handwriting faltered after that. Later entries mention an odor of lye and broth and a presence that watches through the cracks. When he reached Lincoln weeks later, he donated the journal to a parish library, noting he would not speak of that road again. Around the same time, a WPA photographer named Clara Henley captured what is now one of the only known images of the Trevitt ruins. The black and white print shows a sunken doorway, charred timbers, and, in the far background, a single chair standing upright in a field of dust. Henley's field report makes no mention of the object, yet she wrote in the margin, "The chair was not there when I took the shot." The Federal Writers Project, working to document regional folklore, interviewed several Nebraskans about the story. One elderly informant described Trevitt as a man who believed the earth owed him supper. Another said the hollow was never haunted, only hungry. Curiously, when researchers tried to locate official documentation from the county, court filings, coroner's records, property deeds, they found the archives incomplete. A fire in 1928 had destroyed much of the evidence, but even records stored off-site had vanished. 1. Archivists remarked that the gaps seemed too precise to be accidental. As the 1930s drew to a close, the Osage Indian murders were again mentioned in academic circles as an example of rural America's hidden violence. In an article for the Midwest Review, a historian drew a quiet but striking comparison. The Osage crimes dealt in wealth, Trevitt's in hunger. Both devoured what they envied. That single line revived public curiosity. Letters flooded local newspapers asking whether the hollow could still be visited if the cellar yet stood. In truth, only fragments remained: cracked stones, warped nails, and the outline of where the stove had been. A few adventurous photographers tried to document the ruins before they were lost entirely. Some claimed their film fogged over inexplicably. One, a veteran named Harold Keyes, wrote to a friend, "I heard something under the floor, like a pot lid shifting. When I looked down, I swear I saw steam." His photos, when developed, showed nothing unusual, just shadows and weeds. Yet those who examined them often described a faint blur behind the window frame, shaped vaguely like a man. By 1939, the Trevitt site was declared unsafe and officially sealed off by the state. The surrounding acreage was sold for pasture. But even after the fences went up, travelers swore they still caught the smell of cooking when the wind turned north. In 1940, Nebraska's historical societies began cataloging folk legends from the previous century, stories that bridged the line between fact and ghost tale. Among the submissions was an unsigned manuscript labeled simply "The Hollow Guest." Its author remains unknown, but its details align so closely with the Trevitt case that historians now believe it was written by someone who lived there as a child. The manuscript described the homestead before the fire, the odor of salt and smoke, the sound of a ladle scraping iron late at night, and a cellar where the air felt thick, like breathing through cloth. It also mentioned that Trevitt sometimes spoke to visitors who weren't there, as though holding conversations in an empty room. The phrasing was eerie but restrained, more documentary than dramatic. One passage stood out. He said everything fed something else, that we were all part of the same pot. I thought he meant the earth, but later I wondered if he meant us. The manuscript was found in a trunk stored in the courthouse basement at Geneva, alongside fragments of old newspapers and several unsigned photographs. One picture, now faded beyond clarity, appeared to show a man standing beside a large pot suspended over an outdoor fire pit. Only the outline remains visible, an indistinct figure with no discernible face. During that same year, a university archivist named Margaret Klein began preparing a comparative study on frontier violence. In her correspondence with the Nebraska Historical Board, she mentioned the Osage Indian murders once more, using them as a historical framework to contextualize the isolation and secrecy of rural communities. "When I read about Osage County," she wrote, "I am reminded that no place is too quiet to conceal horror. The hollow only proves it again." Klein's letters were methodical, her tone professional. But toward the end, I took on an unease reminiscent of the earlier investigators. She described a field trip to the ruins where she claimed to have heard faint metallic tapping from beneath the soil, as though something below were keeping time. She recorded soil samples, noted a faint iron taste in the air, and departed before dusk. In her final note to a colleague, she wrote, "There are stories the land itself tells. Some you can hear if you stay too long." Klein died the following year in an automobile accident near Lincoln, her research left unfinished. Her assistant, reviewing her papers, discovered a single entry scribbled in haste. "If the stew was served, who set the table?" As the war years began, public interest in such stories waned. Newspapers turned their attention elsewhere, and Grafton Hollow was quietly erased from most maps, its county absorbed into larger jurisdictions. But among local farmers and road workers, the name persisted. They warned each other not to dig too deep near the old creek road. Some claimed that, even after heavy rain, the soil there stayed warm. And sometimes, late travelers said they could see a faint glow in the distance, like firelight through fog. Always in the same direction, always near the ruins. By 1942, the nation was at war, and most of the old-timers who had once whispered about Trevitt's Hollow were gone or moved to the cities. Yet, curiously, the story surfaced again in the form of a brief report in the Lincoln Sentinel, buried on page 7 under Local Curiosities. It read, "Highway surveyors repairing County Road 12 claim to have uncovered an old tin trench containing broken porcelain and bone fragments. State officials declined to comment." The location matched the ruins of the Trevitt homestead almost exactly. The discovery might have passed unnoticed if not for a young reporter, Henry Lowell, who began investigating on his own time. Lowell, just 24 and eager for a story, drove to the site one late evening, accompanied by a photographer. They found the field deserted, the grass long and silver in the moonlight. Lowell's surviving notes, now archived in the University of Nebraska Special Collections, describe what he found there. The ground dips, as if something sank beneath it. There is a smell like old stew, mixed with rust. I thought I heard dripping somewhere underfoot. The photographer, Frank Deaton, took 6 glass plate exposures. Only one developed properly, showing a faint white mist swirling near the trench. He swore he saw a human outline forming within it, but when the plate was processed, the shape appeared more like rising steam. The newspaper refused to print the image, calling it too suggestive. Lowell persisted, piecing together interviews with road workers who had handled the discovery. One, Eddie Stoll, claimed the trench held a line of dinner plates set into the mud. When asked why he hadn't turned them over, Stoll replied, "Didn't want to see what was underneath." Within weeks, Stoll left his job and enlisted in the Army. He never returned. The report died quietly, overshadowed by headlines from overseas. Still, the locals remembered the brief stir. Decades later, a historian researching the Osage Indian murders cited the article as an example of how forgotten crimes often reemerge through chance excavation. The Osage case had ended with prosecutions and notoriety. Trevitt's story remained unsolved, a void in the record that continued to pull in anyone who looked too closely. As for Henry Lowell, he never published his findings. In 1944, he enlisted as a war correspondent and was reported missing near the Ardennes. His sister, who inherited his belongings, donated his typewriter and field notes to the State Historical Museum. On the ribbon still in the machine, the last line he ever typed was half-finished. Some recipes should never be remembered. By the late 1940s, Grafton Hollow had been fully abandoned. The wind flattened what little remained of the Trevitt homestead, scattering brick and timber across the plain. Yet travelers still told each other that on certain nights, when the air hung heavy and the prairie was silent, the smell of cooking drifted faintly along the highway, like supper waiting for a guest who never arrived. By 1947, Nebraska's new generation of settlers, those moving westward after the war, heard little of Grafton Hollow except as a passing curiosity. But for some in nearby towns, the story refused to die. There were letters, private ones, written between elderly residents who remembered the fires and the fear. They passed between homes like a secret inheritance. One such letter, preserved in the county archives, was written by Mrs. Harriet Monroe, widow of the former constable. Her words were shaky but lucid. "I hear the cellar door still creaks when the wind runs low. J.P. used to say the earth never closes over what it doesn't forgive. I don't go near that place, not even now." That same year, the Nebraska State Journal published an editorial reflecting on the fading of frontier legends. Among its examples were the Kearney train bandits, the ghost towns swallowed by drought, and one strange footnote titled, "The Hollow That Ate Its Own." The article mentioned Isaac Trevitt by name, though cautiously, labeling the tale folkloric but persistent. It even compared the rural panic of 1923 to the quiet terror that haunted Osage County a few years earlier, citing how both stories reflected crimes of trust violated beneath open skies. It was one of the last times the Osage case would be invoked alongside the Hollow. Historians would later note that both episodes faded not because they lacked evidence, but because the victims belonged to places the world preferred to forget. In the years that followed, surveyors repurposed the Trevitt property for farmland. A tenant family from Iowa built a modest shack on the southern ridge, unaware of what lay beneath. Within months they abandoned it, claiming that livestock refused to graze nearby and that food spoiled overnight no matter how cold the season. A passing traveler, writing for a rural magazine, recorded seeing the moor, or abandoned pantry. Jars of stew still lined the shelves, lids sealed tight, but the contents had turned black as ink. By 1949, only scattered bones and a few rusted tools remained. The cellar itself had caved in during spring floods, leaving a hollow depression filled with stagnant water. Locals said it looked like an open mouth. That same summer, 2 teenagers camping near the creek vanished without trace. Their campsite was found, but their belongings lay undisturbed, food still warm on the fire. The sheriff, unwilling to revive old panic, blamed it on river misadventure. Yet one deputy noted in his report that a single dinner plate was found half buried in the mud beside the creek, its rim scorched, its center polished smooth. The deputy sealed that note away. It would not resurface until 1960, when a doctoral student compiling data on missing persons found the file among unrelated paperwork. He described it as the most unnerving evidence of rural folklore taking physical form. By then, even the name Trevitt had blurred into legend. Some called him Trent, others Travis or Trevor. Each retelling softened the man and sharpened the myth. Yet all versions agreed on one point. Whatever was buried in that cellar, the land had learned to keep it fed. By 1950, the state's development plans finally reached the forgotten county where Grafton Hollow once lay. The Department of Roads sent a small crew to level the area for a new highway spur. The official report listed it as Routine Excavation Project 47B. What it didn't mention was that the first team refused to finish the job. A foreman named Raymond Goss later gave a statement to his supervisor that read more like a confession than a report. We uncovered a pit lined with tin. Inside were old utensils and crockery, melted together like slag. There was no smell at first, but when the air hit it, the dirt turned dark. I told the men to fill it back. Within a week, 2 workers quit. One claimed he couldn't eat meat anymore, saying the smell clung to his hands no matter how often he washed. The other simply disappeared, his car found abandoned at a service station 30 miles away. The state inspector ordered the pit sealed with concrete and rerouted the road 50 yards north. The area was recorded as a subsurface instability zone, though locals continued calling it the Hollow Mile. Travelers sometimes stopped along that stretch to rest and noticed something strange, a faint warmth rising from the ground even in winter. Around this time, a folklorist named Helen Dorsey, who was collecting rural ghost stories for a radio program, interviewed descendants of those who had once lived near Grafton Hollow. She found the tale still alive but twisted through generations. In her broadcast transcript she noted, "They speak of him now as a spirit of famine, a man who cooked what the land denied him. The stew, they say, was his confession." Her program aired only once, late at night on a regional AM station. Dorsey mentioned in her notes that she had visited the old road herself, recording ambient sounds for the episode. On playback, she heard what she described as the faint clinking of cutlery, rhythmic, distant, impossible. The tape was lost soon after broadcast, though a surviving engineer remembered the sound as clear as wind in a pan. Even in official circles, the legend refused to die. A short editorial in the Nebraska Historical Review that same year compared Grafton Hollow to older frontier tragedies. The writer paraphrased a passage from the Osage Indian murders investigation, noting how some crimes rot into the soil until they become indistinguishable from the land itself. The line struck readers as poetic, but for those who remembered Trevitt, it felt more literal. That autumn, a road maintenance worker reported seeing a single lantern burning near the sealed pit just before dawn. When he approached, it flickered out, leaving only the smell of iron and something faintly sweet in the air. He never returned to that route again. By year's end, maps labeled the entire section closed reserve. No reason was given. But truckers passing through at night still spoke of seeing someone walking the roadside, thin, stooped, carrying what looked like a pot. By the mid-1950s, Grafton Hollow existed only in local memory and the occasional line in academic papers about forgotten frontier crimes. The state had paved over most of the old trail, but the story found new life through rumor. Soldiers returning from the Korean War told each other about the Cook of County 12, a figure said to appear in rearview mirrors when driving past the Hollow Mile at night. It might have ended there, another roadside ghost tale, had not an archaeologist named Dr. Everett Lang decided to re-examine the site as part of a geological survey in 1955. Lang specialized in soil stratification but had a side interest in folklore. According to his assistant's notes, he was determined to separate myth from residue. Lang and his small team drilled several test cores along the highway embankment. At 8 feet deep, one sample came up darker than the others, oily, metallic, and faintly aromatic. Chemical analysis later revealed high traces of calcium and phosphorus consistent with organic decomposition. In a personal letter to the University of Nebraska, Lang wrote, "If this were simply livestock waste, it would have dispersed by now. The layer is too uniform, too deliberate." He never published those results. The university declined further funding, noting that the area had been declared sealed property. But Lang's assistant, Jonas Wirth, later told a colleague that the professor had found something else, something he buried again before leaving. Wirth never clarified what it was, only that Lang returned from the field, pale, trembling, and muttering, "The cellar's still breathing." That same year, a severe storm tore through the plains, flooding the lowlands around the Old Creek Road. Farmers later claimed that after the storm, pieces of porcelain and bone surfaced in nearby ditches, scattered like relics. County crews cleaned the debris quietly, and recorded it as domestic refuse. In 1956, the Midwest Chronicle ran a retrospective on rural legends. It included a brief section on Nebraska's cannibal homesteader, drawing indirect parallels to the Osage Indian murders, again using the historical event as a reference point to explain how whole communities could ignore horrors beneath their noses. The writer concluded with a haunting line, "Where greed built houses in Osage County, hunger built one in Grafton Hollow." That comparison, once more, tied Trevitt's legend to real history, anchoring it not in the supernatural, but in human frailty. Lang resigned from the university the following spring. His final field diary ends with an unfinished entry. "The cellar exhales at night." No further excavation was attempted. Yet in photographs from aerial surveys taken in 1958, faint circular impressions can still be seen near the original property line, patterns that some say resemble dining tables seen from above. When asked about it years later, a retired pilot who flew those surveys said simply, "I didn't see tables, I saw plates." By 1959, the legend of Isaac Trevitt had become one of those stories that lived between folklore and official silence. Scholars at the University of Nebraska occasionally referenced it in lectures about myth formation, always prefacing it as an unverified case of rural hysteria. Yet some still pursued its traces, quietly, like moths drawn to a lingering ember. That year, a graduate student named Ellen Voss began compiling her thesis on frontier folklore and collective memory. Among her field notes was a section devoted entirely to Grafton Hollow. She managed to track down the few remaining witnesses, older farmers who still remembered their parents' whispered warnings. One man, Samuel Reed, gave her an account that would reshape the legend. They say the last stew was served to a man who came to sell hymn books. Trevitt didn't like preachers, said they blessed what should stay buried. Ellen cross-referenced Reed's recollection with church registries from 1923. One circuit minister, Reverend Charles Fenn, had indeed gone missing that year while traveling between Geneva and Fairbury. His name matched one of the initials in Trevitt's lost ledger, CF. The coincidence was chilling. During her research, Ellen corresponded frequently with Dr. Margaret Klein's surviving assistant, who had once linked the hollow to the Osage Indian murders in academic papers. The assistant's letters are preserved today in university archives, one of them noting, "It's not the crimes themselves that connect them, but the silence afterward." Osage had oil, Hollow had hunger. Both made people look away. Ellen found this parallel persuasive and wrote it directly into her thesis draft, paraphrasing it later in interviews as the morality of neglect. She argued that the hollow was not simply haunted, it was remembered because no one was ever held to account. While visiting the site in late autumn of 1959, Ellen recorded a short reel of audio with an old portable machine. On playback, the first 30 seconds contained only wind. Then came a faint, rhythmic tapping, like metal against stone, and a low voice whispering something indecipherable. Some thought it was interference. Others weren't so sure. When Ellen presented her findings in 1960, Her committee praised the historical rigor, but discouraged her from dwelling on atmospheric embellishment. She graduated, published a shortened version of her thesis, and later left academia. But her private field notes, released after her death, contained one final observation. The Hollow isn't a story, it's a place that remembers being watched. In 1961, the state declared the surrounding acreage a restricted floodplain, closing it permanently to development. Ironically, the move preserved what little remained of Trevitt's farm. From above, the land appeared scarred, an oval patch of darker soil surrounded by lighter fields. Locals called it the Stew Bowl. And still every few years, a hunter or surveyor would claim to hear the scrape of metal somewhere below the ground, like someone stirring slowly, patiently, waiting for company. By 1963, the Trevitt legend found new breath through a quiet resurgence of interest in true frontier crime. Television and pulp magazines were beginning to romanticize the outlaw era, but a few writers looked instead at darker corners, stories that had never found resolution. One such journalist was Thomas Avery, a freelance reporter from Kansas City who specialized in regional mysteries. Avery visited Grafton Hollow that spring, armed with an old Rolleiflex camera and the optimism of someone sure he could turn myth into copy. He spent 3 days interviewing residents from nearby towns, sleeping in his truck at night near the sealed-off road. His notes, later recovered from his estate, recount something peculiar about his final night there. At 2:14 a.m., the wind stopped, completely. I heard clinking from the ditch, as if someone were washing dishes. No light, no footsteps, just the sound. He never filed his story. A few months later, Avery died of carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. Authorities ruled it accidental. But when police inventoried his belongings, they found an undeveloped roll of film labeled Hollow Cellar, Third Night. The negatives, when processed years later, showed only streaks of white mist, and in one frame, what appeared to be a pale hand pressed against glass. In 1964, a professor of cultural anthropology, Dr. Henry Mallard, referenced Avery's death while teaching about myth persistence in isolated communities. He drew another comparison, subtle but deliberate, to the Osage Indian murders. When communities refuse to face their buried truths, he said in lecture notes, those truths re-emerge as hauntings. He cited Trevitt's Hollow as a regional example of moral blindness turned legend. Mallard's observation renewed academic curiosity. Graduate students began visiting the area, mapping soil composition, re-examining county reports, and even interviewing aging residents who remembered the Hollow as children. One of them, Louise Carter, daughter of the old storekeeper, spoke with calm clarity despite her age. He wasn't a monster at first. He was a neighbor. The monster came after we stopped looking. That line appeared in the American Folklore Quarterly in 1965, sparking one of the few serious analyses of the Hollow as both history and metaphor. The journal's editor concluded that, while supernatural claims were unfounded, the persistence of the tale illustrates the same pattern seen in Osage County, a collective refusal to acknowledge complicity until it curdles into myth. By the late 1960s, the Hollow had entered classroom discussions on folklore and trauma. Yet for all the distance academia provided, those who ventured near the site claimed it still felt unsettled. Hunters spoke of hearing cutlery faintly clinking in the wind. Surveyors mentioned the faint smell of burnt broth on dry days. In 1968, a student documentary crew attempted to record ambient sound there for a thesis film. The footage was never finished. Only the sound reel survived. When played decades later, archivists described it as a slow scrape followed by a bubbling noise like something cooking under the soil. The tape ends abruptly, followed by 4 seconds of silence. By the early 1970s, the legend of Grafton Hollow had become one of those half-whispered stories that slipped between academia and campfire. Urban writers visiting the Midwest for travel columns often mentioned it as Nebraska's ghost that eats. Yet, in the small towns surrounding the old floodplain, the story was treated with a quiet, uneasy respect, never mocked, never forgotten. In 1972, a graduate researcher named Mark Ellison began a project funded by the Historical Preservation Board to document lost settlements of Nebraska. He intended to write about agricultural decline, but inevitably stumbled upon the hollow's name in abandoned courthouse registries. The sparse entries fascinated him. Tax documents with missing owners, police reports without follow-ups, an endless paper trail that led nowhere. Ellison drove out to the region in August, carrying an old 16mm camera and a notebook. He spent one night near the dried creek bed that had once bordered Trevitt's property. His field log, discovered years later in a university archive, recounts. At dusk, a smell like boiled salt meat rose with the wind. There was a sound, steady, rhythmic, metallic. I thought it was cattle bells, but there are no herds for miles. He filmed the area the following morning. The footage shows tall weeds, rusted fence wire, and the faint outline of foundation stones. But for a few frames, there's movement. A distortion of heat or smoke, rippling just above the ground where the cellar once stood. The effect could easily be sunlight refracting through dust. Still, Ellison wrote afterward, the air shimmered as if from an invisible fire. Back in Lincoln, he screened his film for his faculty advisor. The older man watched in silence, then reportedly said, "You've filmed a place that doesn't want to be remembered." Ellison's documentary was never released. He left academia the next year, moving east to work in historical restoration. But before he left, he donated his materials to the State Archive with one condition, that no one use them for public exhibition. Inside the box, archivists found a note taped to the camera case. It's still cooking. In 1975, a Nebraska public radio broadcast revisited old rural legends. The host paraphrased both the Osage Indian murders and the Trevitt tale, contrasting them as stories born from need and silence. The episode aired only once, late at night, and generated more listener mail than any other in the series. Many claimed to have grown up hearing versions of the Hollow story from parents or grandparents who swore it was true. One letter read simply, "My father worked that land. He said the soil never cooled." That same year, a farmer plowing near the restricted floodplain reported his tractor stalling for no reason. When he climbed down, he said the ground beneath the tires was warm to the touch, even though frost still clung to the fields. The county surveyor who inspected it later wrote, "Subsurface heat likely from gas pockets, but the air smelled culinary." It would be the last recorded official visit to the Hollow for over a decade. By the early 1980s, Grafton Hollow had become a folkloric curiosity for radio hosts and amateur historians alike, an unsolved mystery too strange to disprove and too unsettling to ignore. Most people who heard about it dismissed it as myth, yet the older families of central Nebraska still refused to drive the Hollow Mile after dark. They would say, "The road remembers who ate there." In 1981, a writer for the Great Plains Review, Linda Herron, decided to revisit the Hollow for a feature titled The Forgotten Table. She was fascinated by rural legends that mixed class struggle and crime. Her essay opened with a paraphrase of the Osage Indian murders, reminding readers that the Midwest's quiet fields had fed on both greed and hunger. It was the last time a mainstream publication would mention Trevitt by name. Herron spent 2 nights near the old floodplain. According to her tape recorder logs, she conducted interviews with elderly residents in Geneva and Clay Center. One woman, Nora Hayes, claimed her mother had once seen Trevitt alive long after the fire. He was at the fair in 28, buying beef stew from a vendor. He just smiled and said, "Nothing beats home cooking." Herron included that quote in her final draft, but admitted she could never verify it. Her private journal, discovered decades later, revealed that she experienced recurring nausea during her stay. She wrote that the air near the ruins tasted metallic, like wet pennies and smoke. One night she recorded faint noises that she described as the steady rhythm of stirring. When she played back the tape, it stopped abruptly at the 22-minute mark, replaced by the faint hiss of boiling. The review published her article in spring 1982, but the issue was quietly recalled due to printing errors. Few physical copies remain today. Heron herself withdrew from journalism a year later, moving to Maine, and never discussing the story again. By 1984, state maintenance crews paved over the last visible trace of County Road 12. The hollow was officially gone, buried beneath asphalt and prairie grass. Yet truck drivers still swore they could see something flicker in the rearview mirror when crossing that stretch at night, like firelight or a lantern swinging in the dark. In 1986, a maintenance report documented a curious detail. The road surface directly above the former cellar site warped every summer from underground heat, despite no pipeline or geothermal source nearby. Engineers resurfaced it twice, but each year the same spot bubbled upward again. One supervisor finally remarked in frustration, "It's like something underneath keeps breathing." The incident was never made public, but word traveled through construction crews and local diners. By 1987, the hollow was once more a whispered name, this time among the living who paved over it, not those who remembered it. Old-timers said it was proof that some stories never end because they were never finished. And some meals, once begun, are never quite cleared from the table. By the early 1990s, the hollow had slipped from history books entirely, yet it lingered quietly among truckers, farmers, and long-distance travelers who shared stories at diners along Highway 81. Some called it the stew stretch, others simply the warm road. The legend always began the same way: a man who cooked his guests, and ended with the same warning: don't stop if you smell something good. In 1991, a graduate filmmaker named David Lorne from Omaha decided to make a short documentary on vanishing Midwestern folklore. He chose Grafton Hollow after finding Ellen Voss's old thesis in the university archives. The reel-to-reel tape labeled Hollow Wind, 1959, caught his attention, especially the faint clinking sound at its end. Lorne and his small crew drove to the floodplain in October, bringing handheld cameras and portable microphones. They interviewed retired road workers and a few elderly locals. One, Tom Goss, claimed his father had worked on the 1950s highway project that sealed the cellar pit. He said they poured the concrete, but it sank overnight, Tom recalled. He used to dream about bubbles coming up from under it. The crew spent their final night recording ambient sound along the road. Around midnight, they captured what they described as a low, simmering noise, like water about to boil. In the footage, one cameraman whispers, "You smell that?" And the recording cuts off abruptly. The next morning, the crew returned to Omaha, shaken but unharmed. When Lorne developed the film, one frame showed something odd, a shimmer near the asphalt that looked like heat mirage, but with faint shapes inside, circles, almost like plates. He dismissed it as lens flare, but noted that his camera lens had fogged with condensation despite the cold. The short film, Echoes of the Hollow, premiered at a small college theater in 1993. During the screening, the audio act distorted at the same timestamp where the crew had heard the simmering noise. Several audience members later said they smelled something faintly meaty in the room, though the theater confirmed no food had been served. That same year, the Nebraska Historical Quarterly published a brief essay connecting the Trevitt legend once again to the Osage Indian murders, framing both as examples of violence normalized through silence. The author paraphrased an Osage investigator's reflection: "The worst crimes are not the ones we remember, but the ones we bury so well they become the ground we walk on." It was a fitting echo, both literal and moral. After the screening, Lorne withdrew the film from circulation, refusing further interviews. When asked years later, he said only, "The sound was still there after the projector stopped." By 1996, a few local teens had rediscovered the site through his documentary, venturing out at night for dares. Some returned claiming to hear clinking silverware under the dirt. Others said they saw faint lights in the fields, moving in slow circles like someone setting a table. Nothing ever appeared on film, yet the smell of stew, warm, faintly sweet, was often reported when the wind blew east. By the early 2000s, the hollow existed only as a rumor passed through internet forums and local ghost tours. Bloggers argued over whether Isaac Trevitt had been real, while amateur historians scoured county archives that no longer held any of the original case files. Each search ended the same way, with blank pages, missing ledgers, and unanswered questions. Still, on certain nights, travelers driving the old stretch of Highway 81 wrote about strange phenomena in their journals or online: faint lights flickering in the cornfields, the smell of cooked meat without smoke, the sound of ladles scraping iron. One trucker wrote, "It's the kind of smell that makes you hungry until you remember you're alone." In 2003, a local historian named Professor Ann Kettridge revisited the case for a regional anthology on forgotten American legends. Her essay drew direct parallels to the Osage Indian murders, suggesting that both reflected the moral blindness that thrives in silence. She wrote, paraphrasing earlier researchers, "Where Osage County buried its greed under oil, Grafton Hollow buried its hunger under soil." The comparison stirred brief controversy in academic circles, with critics arguing that Kettridge blurred folklore and fact. But her work ensured the hollow would not vanish completely. It lived on in the margins, tethered to history through that single echo of the real world. Today, the exact site lies beneath an unmarked curve of highway, surrounded by grain fields. The land appears ordinary, quiet, featureless, and dry. Yet surveyors still note the same anomaly reported decades ago. The ground temperature there remains slightly higher than the surrounding area, even in winter. No pipes, no geothermal vents, just warmth, steady and faint, like the breath of something sleeping. Occasionally, hikers or road crews stumble upon fragments after heavy rain: a rusted hung, ing, a scorched spoon, shards of porcelain with soot baked into the glaze. The state records them as artifacts of indeterminate origin, but locals don't need reports to know. They simply say, "The cellar's still cooking." Every few years, someone stops along that road at dusk, drawn by curiosity or maybe by the faint promise of comfort drifting through the air. They step out, listen to the stillness, smell something warm and familiar, and feel an inexplicable pull toward the earth. No one ever stays long. No one ever digs. Because in Grafton Hollow, time itself seems to have sealed the lid on its own story. A stew left simmering somewhere below the surface, its recipe forgotten, but its scent still rising through the dust. And if you pass through Nebraska late at night, and the wind carries a trace of something cooking, don't stop. Keep driving. The hollow is patient. It always waits for another guest.